Okay, I think the easiest form to start with is going to be the nose. Let's go ahead and do a wireframe analysis of the nose and the reference. Make a new layer. Feel free to follow along. In one of the earlier lessons, I was kind of driving home the idea of several different shapes. You have sphere, cylinder, the cheese wedge shape, as well as the kind of horseshoe or magnet shape of the jaw. In this case, we'll just see how the nose actually encompasses that kind of wedge shape. So let's just do it over here real quick at this angle. So here's the back of the wedge shape. And if we go like this with that front part of the rectangle and then connect it like this in 3D, that's the shape that we're kind of going for. In fact, if we just take this and overlay it right in there, you could see it inside. Let's do it again on top of the layer. So back here, the nose will start. And you can kind of fit that in perspective, and you can kind of see the angle of the perspective by looking at these lines between the eyes and the corners of the mouth, which will give us this angle. Okay, so if we can draw that shape, that's our start. Let's move that over here. Obviously, it's not a perfect sharp edge like a rectangle there. It's curved like a cylinder. So what we're going to do to understand the form of the nose is to draw a cylinder on that spot. Just with a different color, just to show that it's rounded here. All right. We can take that and move it over. Goes right on top, fair enough. And then we're going to introduce some spheres. Now, granted, the tip of the nose isn't actually a perfect sphere, but it's a good starting point. So we have the first sphere, the second sphere, and we don't actually see the third sphere, but it's back there. Once you have those, now you can connect that like this in terms of geometry. We can move that over here. And you can see how those basic forms, just looking at the wireframe, start to make the forms of the nose. Now, if we connect all this together and then kind of connect the geometry like that, we can pretty easily just make a new layer underneath it and test that in terms of the forms based on our studies of the different shapes and how light affects them. For example, we know that the sphere is going to have that core shadow. We know that the cylinder is going to have a core shadow going along the forms. And so if we lower the opacity of this real quick, we don't even need the reference for that. But we know that the light is coming from the top left. Let's just fill that in with any value. And then we can just put light on this whole side of everything because that side is facing the light. But we know that the cylinder part will have a soft transition. So it's going to be rounded like that. And then here, the sphere will receive light like this, and it kind of curves downward. And if we take that and move it above that line work, it starts to have that three-dimensional form of a nose. Now, granted, for the actual nose, it's far more nuanced and complex, but this is the starting point. There's a sphere on the end over here. Could even lower the opacity to kind of see how that form actually is underneath there. And just by doing that, we could even carve into it. A nostril, some interesting shapes here. Go up like that. So on and so forth. But we're not done just yet. Because now that we have those basic shapes, the wedge and the three spheres and the cylinder, there's something happening up here. And while the wedge shape is in there and you have the cylinder on top of it, it connects to the brow ridge for this person like this. So this part, it's hard to describe, but it's almost like a water fountain effect where it's a reverse umbrella, the negative space that would happen if you have two spheres. Well, you do have two spheres here causing the sort of ripple effect of that. But anyway, it does a sort of shape like this, and then it curves back again for the brow ridge, right? So let's just go up here and specify what I mean by that reverse shape. So like, let's just draw a top-down view. Like that's the kind of funnel fountain shape that I'm talking about. And if we just attach the nose to that, and then this side of the nose and the sphere, and then the brow ridge, it sort of gives us the information that we need to draw that area. Now, granted, this is very different depending on the person you're looking at, but in this case, we're going to be studying different people throughout this lesson. But in this case, this is what's happening. So if we go ahead and attach that to this, here's the center line, and go like that. And this is a very important subtlety. And that's actually the part of the nose that the nasal cavity is here, because you don't have bone all the way throughout the nose, you have cartilage. But there's a certain point where it transitions from cartilage area to the nose, because the nasal cavity, if you were to just draw a hole here, that's what it would be for a sort of X-ray to see the skull. And you would even have like a highlight right there, right? That's why oftentimes you'll have a highlight right there in flash photography or any photos of people with bright lights. Okay, so the question is, how do we render a shape like that? All right, we don't even need the reference for it. Now, since the light is in the top left, we know that this area will be in shadow for sure, right here. Let's actually borrow that value from down there. And this part will be in light. And then you could actually take the value of the cylinder part and just pull that all the way up and then fade into a shadow over here. And use the airbrush to kind of smooth everything out. And hey, you could even put that highlight right there. And suddenly we have the form of the nose. Now, we're going to be doing this for each part, but then actually apply it to the reference. But I want to really drive home the forms of the facial features this way. And I think slowly, carefully looking at it like this will help a lot. But before we carry on, let's actually come back down to the tip of the nose here. Let's make that a different color so we don't mess with it. Let's erase that. I want to sort of subdivide on the actual shapes here on the tip of the nose. Because earlier I just said there were spheres, but obviously more complex than that. Now, if they were high poly spheres, you're going to have all these polygons, right? Okay. Now, if you take that same sphere and make a low poly version of it, you're going to have less polygons that make up that sphere. So it's kind of like a old Nintendo 64 model or PlayStation. And you can kind of do that indefinitely and find as few polygons as possible you can get away with. But the reason I did it like that is because while this might be a sphere as a starting point, the low poly version of it will have a polygon like this, like this, and a smaller one here, smaller one, a bigger one there, and something like that. Now, it changed from being a sphere to a slightly different proportion thing, but this is what I'm kind of focusing on to kind of drive one specific idea home, and that is where the actual highlights are. So over here, if we render that as a low poly, halfway to black, all these would be in shadow. And some of them will be in between. And then this one would be in highlight, right? And if you can render a low poly sphere like that, you should be able to look at a nose and understand the different planes of that tip, right? And it might even help to do a low poly study by tracing over a wireframe or a photo of somebody. So over here, while it was a sphere, now we can see that there's this plane, that plane, and that plane. And then they connect like this. Well, like that. Right. So over here, instead of just having the spheres, which we know how to render because we know that there's going to be a hot spot highlight and then a core shadow, now we can sort of make it a little bit more specific. A very careful and focused kind of detective work. You're investigating what the actual polygons are doing. And I'm going to repeat this a lot, but as long as you do this over and over again, very carefully, very slowly, it'll become second nature and very intuitive for you when you're doing your own work. So over here, there's that sphere, but we're going to make a low poly version of it. I like to start with just the front facing one, and then this one, and the thinner one here, and then a bigger one there, which gives us the geometry. Same thing over here. We know that this middle one, by the way, is going to go all the way and connect to that one. Right. And so just having the reference off, knowing that we know how to put light on faces that are facing up and facing away. So we can just put this stuff in shadow. It doesn't have to be accurate values right now. We just want to convey the information. This stuff is in shadow. Down here it'll be in shadow. There might be a midtone here. This one's slightly facing away. And then just put a highlight on one of these. Of course, this changes depending on where the light is. But now it looks like a nose. This is the thing to study. Break things down like this and you'll be doing great in no time. All right, so if you want, you could even take this low poly version and then blend it. Let's see what happens when we do that. I'm using the mixer brush, and I'm actually using Plastic Wrap Light 90. It's a pretty fun one. It kind of has a nice grit to it, rather than my usual rough round bristle 14. But we're just going to blend these shapes together. Be sure not to let these values mix in with the values over here. You want to keep them separate so that the form still reads. And of course, you could be as loose as you want with it. Now we zoom out, it's like, oh, okay, and it has that kind of painterly look. But you have to know where the planes of the face, and in this case the nose, are going to receive light. If you don't, well, then it will look a little bit off. We could even make this highlight stand out a bit more, and I like to do this a lot and sort of stylize and push specifically this by making the area above it also dark, just subtly. If you look at a lot of really old black and white photography, the exposures that they used to have in their cameras would really let the nose get pretty dark and the highlights pop out a lot. I recommend studying that for sure. Anyway. Very easy. No problem. All right, now you are a master at painting noses. Well, not yet. We'll get there. Let's go ahead and apply that to here based on the reference. Now, let me go ahead and make this black and white using the color profile trick. So if you go to View, Proof Setup, Custom, and you set the device to simulate to working gray dot grain 20%, whenever you press Control Y or Command Y if you're on a Mac, it'll make everything black and white as the proof setup. Let's move this over here, move that over there.